The night air was thick with tension. Edward's bloodied body lay motionless on the floor, his eyes wide open in shock, as if trying to grasp the impossibility of what had just occurred. Beside him, Agatha, his wife, was crumpled in a corner, her face twisted in disbelief, clutching her throat as though she were still trying to scream. The silence in the room was deafening. Then, the door creaked open, and Barbara stepped into the chaos, her heels clicking ominously against the wooden floor. Her face was calm, almost clinical, as she surveyed the scene. Behind her, Alfred stood motionless, his expression unreadable. It was too late to turn back now. The plan had come to fruition, and its consequences would be far more than anyone had imagined. The story takes place in the affluent neighborhood of Pacific Heights in San Francisco, California, in 2025. The sleek, modern house of Edward and Agatha sits high on the hill, offering a breathtaking view of the city and the bay below. The couple's home is meticulously curated, every surface gleaming, every corner perfectly organized. However, tonight it was anything but serene. Edward is tall, with broad shoulders and short-cropped dark hair that's starting to thin at the temples. His jaw is sharp, and his deep-set brown eyes often give him an intense, almost brooding look. His appearance betrays the weight of his frustrations. A man who once had everything but now feels lost in his own skin. He dresses in expensive suits, but the sharp lines of his clothes do little to mask his internal chaos. Behind his confident, polished exterior lies a man desperate for change, seeking anything to break free from the monotony of his marriage. Edward's voice is firm, authoritative, but there's an edge to it, as though he is constantly on the brink of losing control. Agatha, Edward's wife, is strikingly beautiful, with long chestnut hair that cascades in waves around her shoulders. Her fair skin contrasts with her sharp green eyes, which hold a mixture of intelligence and weariness. Agatha's beauty is the kind that turns heads, but beneath it lies a quiet sadness. She has always been the calm presence in their marriage, though lately she's felt suffocated by it. Her voice is soft, often thoughtful, but when she speaks with conviction, it can cut through the air like a knife. Agatha's beauty and grace hide her growing dissatisfaction with her life, her marriage, and the lack of genuine connection. Alfred is ruggedly handsome, with dark, unkempt hair and a few days' worth of stubble on his face. His body is muscular and sturdy, built from years of hard labor in his business dealings, and his broad chest always seems to be straining against his clothing. There's a magnetic quality to him, a certain predatory charm that both draws people in and makes them wary. His blue eyes are piercing, always observing, calculating, searching for an opening. His voice is deep and low, carrying a weight of authority without needing to raise it. Alfred exudes confidence, but it's a controlled kind. He never loses his cool, and that's what makes him dangerous. He's used to getting what he wants, and tonight he intends to get exactly what he's been plotting. Barbara, Alfred's wife, is a striking woman with platinum blonde hair that falls in perfect curls around her face. Her skin is porcelain-like, and her eyes, a pale gray, often seem to be cold, distant, as though she's always observing from afar. She carries herself with a queen-like confidence, her movements deliberate and measured. Barbara's beauty is more calculated than Agatha's. Everything about her is meticulously arranged. She's the kind of woman who knows how to play people like a game of chess, each move considered, every word calculated. Her voice is smooth, almost hypnotic, but there's an underlying menace in her tone. She's not here for games. She's here for control. Edward and Agatha had been friends with Alfred and Barbara for years. Their relationships at first had been simple: dinners, drinks, the occasional vacation together. But as time passed, cracks began to form. Edward felt his marriage with Agatha growing stale, their conversations no longer meaningful, their intimacy a distant memory. Agatha, in turn, had grown resentful, feeling as though she was married to a stranger, a man whose dreams and desires no longer aligned with hers. On the other hand, Alfred and Barbara's marriage was complicated. Alfred, a businessman with a checkered past, had never been satisfied with anything: his wealth, his power, and even his wife. He was always seeking more, something darker, more thrilling. Barbara, for her part, had long known her marriage was a game of manipulation. She had grown bored with Alfred's unspoken expectations and had secretly begun to plot ways to exert control, especially over Edward. The idea of swapping wives came up during one of their late-night conversations, fueled by too much wine and too little self-restraint. At first, it was a joke, a flippant suggestion made by Alfred, but it quickly took root in their minds. The prospect of escaping their own troubled marriages, if only for a night, was tantalizing. But as they discussed it further, the fantasy became something far darker, a game of dominance, submission, and ultimately betrayal. Barbara, with her cold, calculating nature, saw it as a way to cement her control over both men. Alfred, eager to prove his superiority, couldn't resist the challenge. Agatha, though hesitant, felt an urge to break free from her own suffocating reality. And Edward? He was already too deep into his desire for change, too desperate to break free from the prison of his own making. The plan was set in motion. Agatha and Edward invited Alfred and Barbara to their home for what seemed like an innocent dinner party. But as the night wore on, the lines between fantasy and reality blurred. The mood shifted. Words were exchanged, looks lingered too long. The invitation, once light-hearted, was now a trap. The walls of the house, which had once been a sanctuary, felt suffocating. The rooms seemed to close in on them. Agatha and Edward had no idea what they were truly walking into. They had no idea how far Alfred and Barbara were willing to push them or what was truly at stake. The scene was set. The invitation had been accepted. But what none of them knew was that this night would change everything. And by the time the sun rose, one of them would never walk out of that house again. The dim light of the chandelier flickered softly above the polished dining table, casting long, delicate shadows against the walls of Edward and Agatha's home. The evening was meant to be an ordinary dinner party, the kind they had hosted many times before, but tonight there was a difference in the air, a tension that both of them could feel, but neither had yet acknowledged. Agatha stood by the stove, her back turned to the room, stirring a pot of risotto with mechanical precision. She had chosen this dish for its simplicity, hoping it would be enough to mask the nervous energy she couldn't shake. The deep brown of the wooden cabinetry reflected the warm glow of the stove light, but Agatha felt cold. The house had never felt more like a cage. Edward, perched on the edge of a plush armchair, glanced at his wife. He was waiting for the right moment, or perhaps the right excuse to bring up the suggestion, the one they had been circling around for weeks. But as Agatha stirred the pot, lost in her thoughts, Edward hesitated. He watched her back, the elegant curve of her neck, her slight, almost imperceptible size as she worked, and felt a surge of frustration. Their marriage, once built on spontaneity and passion, now seemed like a series of performances, smiles, pleasantries, and hollow gestures. "Are you sure about tonight?" Edward asked, his voice low, but still carrying a sharpness that he hadn't intended. Agatha didn't look up from her work. "You mean about Alfred and Barbara?" Edward nodded, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "Do you think it's a good idea?" Agatha's hand stilled. For a moment the room was silent, save for the soft bubbling of the risotto. Then Agatha turned to face him, a trace of something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Edward, I'm not sure about anything anymore," she said, her tone tinged with exhaustion. "But we both know that something has to change. She paused, taking a deep breath. "I don't know if this is the right answer, but I've already agreed to it." Edward's lips curled into a tight, forced smile. He could feel the weight of the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Agatha was as lost as he was. They both were. But the promise of something new, something daring, something dangerous, had been enough to pull them in. An hour later, Edward stood by the door, adjusting his cufflinks, his reflection in the mirror a stark reminder of the man he used to be. The confident, ambitious man who had once led meetings with ease and commanded a room with a mere glance. But now, as he adjusted the fabric of his tailored suit, all he saw was a man eager to escape his own skin. The doorbell rang, sharp and abrupt, pulling him from his thoughts. He checked his watch. On time, of course. Barbara's voice carried from the hallway before he could even open the door. "Edward, darling, how are you?" she said, her tone sugar-sweet, but with a touch of something colder underneath. She was standing on the doorstep, her platinum curls cascading over her shoulders, her expensive red dress glinting beneath the porch light. Alfred was beside her, hands tucked casually into his pockets. His confident smile stretched across his face. "Come in," Edward said, stepping aside. As they walked in, Barbara immediately took control, her eyes scanning the room with an almost predatory gaze. Alfred followed closely behind, his steps slow and deliberate, as though he were measuring each footfall. His gaze flickered to Agatha, who was finishing up in the kitchen, and for just a moment, there was an unmistakable glint of something darker in his eyes. "Good evening, Agatha," Barbara said, her voice a little too smooth, almost mechanical. She gave a smile that was far too wide for comfort, and Agatha, sensing the undercurrent, smiled back faintly. "Evening, Barbara." "Alfred," Agatha replied, her voice steady, though the slight tremor in it betrayed her nerves. The dinner started like any other. Polite conversation, small talk, laughter that rang a little too hollow, the clink of wine glasses, and the soft hum of classical music playing in the background. But beneath the surface, the dynamics had already begun to shift. The wine flowed freely, each glass refilled without asking. Alfred was the first to break the tension, his voice carrying a note of amusement as he leaned back in his chair. "You know, Edward," Alfred began, his gaze unwavering, "I've been thinking about how long we've all known each other. It's been what, 10 years now?" Edward nodded, raising his glass. "Too long, perhaps." He chuckled lightly, trying to maintain his composure. "Too long to stay bored," Alfred continued, his tone now taking on a darker edge. "Don't you ever get tired of the same thing? Same routine? Same everything?" Agatha shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the heat of the wine now beginning to catch up with her. She caught Barbara's eyes for a moment, but there was no warmth there, only a calculating coldness. Agatha could feel her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure what it was about Barbara's stare, but it made her uneasy, the way she watched her, as though she were a specimen under a microscope. "It's not about boredom," Agatha replied, her voice firm despite her unease. "It's about finding what you want from life, and trying to make it work." "Exactly," Barbara interjected, her voice a silky whisper. "Which is why we should all talk about, new possibilities. Different ways of looking at things, perhaps." Edward's brow furrowed as he picked up on the subtle shift in the conversation. "What are you suggesting?" Barbara smiled, her eyes darkening. "Just imagine," she said slowly, leaning forward. "What if you could step outside your little bubble, explore something entirely new? Something—" She paused, eyes glinting with an unreadable expression. "Liberating?" Edward's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this, or at least he had hoped it would stay a conversation, not a push. But now, there was no turning back. The air between them thickened with anticipation, and in that moment, Edward realized that the night was no longer a simple dinner gathering. "It's only a suggestion," Alfred said with a lazy grin. but I think you two might find it interesting. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew heavier, more deliberate. The wine continued to flow, and with it, their inhibitions slowly unraveled. It wasn't until dessert was served, a rich chocolate mousse, that Alfred finally made his move. I think we should all talk about something that could be fun, he said, looking at Edward and Agatha in turn. His eyes were piercing, like daggers of ice. We've all been in relationships for a long time, haven't we? Barbara added, her voice now cool and commanding. We've had our ups and downs. We know each other well enough. She looked directly at Agatha, her gaze unwavering. What would you say to a little change? Edward's chest tightened. He could feel the walls closing in on him. He looked at Agatha, her eyes wide with disbelief, but a flicker of curiosity danced there too. The words hung between them like a noose, the unspoken proposition hanging in the air, too dangerous to ignore, but too tempting to reject. Alfred leaned forward, a slight grin playing at his lips. Why don't we swap wives? The silence that followed was deafening. Agatha's heart raced, her breath shallow. She turned slowly to look at Edward, the reality of what was being suggested sinking in. The conversation had turned into something else entirely, and neither of them knew how to stop it. It was past midnight when the last of the wine glasses clinked on the table, signaling that the dinner had finally wound down. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary for Edward and Agatha, now seemed oppressive, its walls pressing in on them. The faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city outside felt like echoes of an unspoken truth. This night was no longer just a dinner party. It was a confrontation, a test of wills, and the path that had been set in motion earlier that evening was now unstoppable. Edward stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The skyline of San Francisco shimmered under the night sky, a sharp contrast to the darkness that was consuming his mind. He should have never allowed the night to go this far. But as he looked back over his shoulder at Agatha, who was seated at the table talking in quiet tones with Barbara, a strange feeling stirred inside him, a mix of desire and dread. Agatha, too, seemed to sense the shift. She was more quiet than usual, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she listened to Barbara's soft words. But it wasn't her usual placidity that had caught Edward's attention. It was the look in her eyes, a flicker of something dangerous, something unfamiliar. She was no longer just his wife. She was someone else, someone untouchable, someone on the brink of something he couldn't control. Barbara's voice interrupted his thoughts, low and soothing. Her eyes locked onto his. "Edward, darling, are you feeling all right?" There was no warmth in her voice, only a quiet challenge. "I'm fine," Edward replied, but his words came out brittle. He turned to face her. "Just thinking." Alfred, standing near the door with a drink in his hand, observed the exchange with cold detachment, his gaze drifting over the room. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. The game was about to begin, and they all knew it. Agatha stood up slowly, her movements measured, as though she were in a dream. She had excused herself from the table moments ago, and now she walked toward Edward, the low hum of conversation continuing behind her. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floor, each step echoing in the otherwise quiet house. As she neared Edward, she didn't look at him, her eyes trained on the floor. She could feel his gaze on her, but she wouldn't meet it. Not yet. She had come to a realization during their quiet moments at the table, a realization that frightened her, but also exhilarated her. When she reached Edward's side, she finally met his gaze. Her face was pale in the dim light, but her eyes were sharp, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice low enough for only him to hear. Edward raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the intensity in her tone. "About what?" Agatha hesitated for a moment before speaking, her breath shallow. About what they want. About the game they're playing. He didn't respond right away. He just watched her, his eyes flicking over her face as though trying to decipher a code. Then, after a long pause, he took a deep breath and spoke. We knew what this was, Agatha. We knew what they were offering. Yes, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. But I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't think it would be so real. She paused, glancing briefly over her shoulder at Barbara and Alfred, who were now deep in conversation, as if oblivious to the growing tension between the two of them. Edward's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer to Agatha, lowering his voice so that no one else could hear. We have no choice now. It's too late to back out. They're already here. It's already happening. Agatha's eyes darkened, and she looked away from him, her lips curling into a bitter smile. We never had a choice. Not really. Edward's breath caught in his throat, his mind swirling. He knew she was right. The moment they had agreed to this, their choices had been taken from them. The fantasy of swapping had already spiraled beyond their control, and now it was a matter of who would walk away unscathed, or if anyone would. It wasn't long before the tension reached a boiling point. Alfred stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he walked toward Agatha and Edward. His presence loomed over them, and Agatha instinctively stepped back, almost as though retreating from his approach. Well then, Alfred said, his voice carrying a slow, deliberate menace. Let's not waste any more time, shall we? After all, we're all here for the same reason. He cast a pointed glance at Barbara, who was still sitting at the table observing with an unreadable expression. Edward's pulse quickened. What do you want from us, Alfred? Alfred smiled, a slow, wicked smile that spread across his face like a shadow. What I want? Oh, Edward, what I want is simple. I want you to see your wife in a new light. I want you to see her as I do. The words hit Edward like a punch in the gut. He had heard them before, in passing, in joking tones, but never with this weight. Alfred wasn't playing a game anymore. He wasn't asking for some fantasy to be explored. He was claiming something far darker than any of them had imagined. Barbara's voice was cold, cutting through the thick air like a knife. Are we ready, then? She asked, her eyes meeting Agatha's across the room. It's time to start, isn't it? Agatha stood still, her body tense, every fiber of her being screaming at her to run, to stop this madness before it went any further. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if resigning herself to the inevitable. She glanced at Edward, searching for something, anything that might change her mind, but found nothing in his eyes except the same sense of helplessness that mirrored her own. The moment was fragile, poised between hesitation and action. And in the heavy silence that followed, Agatha took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. Let's do this, then. Edward didn't want to let go of Agatha's hand, but as he felt Alfred's gaze on them, he could sense the tension in the room growing unbearable. Barbara and Agatha moved toward each other, the unspoken understanding between them palpable. Without another word, Barbara approached Agatha, and without breaking eye contact, extended her hand to her. Agatha hesitated for a moment, then reached out and accepted Barbara's grip. It wasn't a friendly gesture, but a command. Something passed between them, a subtle exchange that neither woman could fully explain. As Alfred moved closer to Edward, his posture shifted, his body becoming even more imposing. It's time, Alfred murmured, his voice laced with something darker now, almost a challenge. He reached out, brushing his fingers against Edward's arm. Edward flinched, but he didn't pull away. The night had begun, and it would change everything. The morning light filtered through the half-drawn curtains, casting long, muted shadows across the bedroom floor. The silence in the room felt thick, like a fog that clung to the air. suffocating the few words left unsaid. Edward lay in bed, his eyes open but unseeing, his mind still reeling from the events of the night. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, and yet there was a part of him that wished it would never end. Beside him, Agatha lay still, her back to him, her breathing shallow and slow. The distance between them felt wider than it ever had before, a vast chasm that neither of them could cross. Last night had shattered everything. It was no longer just a game. It had become something far darker, something neither of them could control. Edward turned his head, his gaze lingering on Agatha's figure, but she didn't stir. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the back of her shoulder, the touch light and almost hesitant. It felt wrong, but it was the only thing he could do to bridge the gulf that had formed between them. She didn't react. He pulled his hand back, his heart sinking. The thought that had been gnawing at him all night returned. What have we done? Downstairs, the house felt eerily empty. The walls seemed to close in, as if they were slowly suffocating under the weight of the secrets that had been unleashed. The grand staircase creaked as Edward descended, his steps heavy, each one laden with the crushing sense of dread that had settled in his chest. Agatha had already gone downstairs earlier, disappearing into the living room, where she sat motionless, staring out the large bay window. The room was bathed in early morning light, but there was no warmth to it. It only highlighted the emptiness in her eyes. "Agatha," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure what he expected her to say, but when she turned her head toward him, it sent a chill down his spine. Her eyes were distant, her face expressionless. "I don't want to talk about it," she replied, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Edward stood frozen at the entrance of the living room, his fists clenched at his sides. "We need to talk. This—" He gestured to the empty room as if it could explain everything that had happened the night before. "This has gone too far, Agatha. I know," she interrupted, her voice hardening slightly. "I know what we did, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't take back what happened." Her words hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for. An apology, an explanation, some sense of redemption. But there was none to be had. Agatha had already accepted the truth, perhaps even before he had. As if on cue, the sound of a car engine rumbled outside, followed by the screech of brakes. Edward's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly who it was: Alfred and Barbara. The realization hit him hard. They weren't going to leave. They weren't going to let them forget. Agatha stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Without a word, she walked toward the door, but Edward caught her arm before she could leave the room. "Where are you going?" he demanded, his voice rising, desperation creeping in. "I'm going to face them," she said, her voice cold, almost detached. "We can't pretend like this didn't happen, Edward. They're here for a reason." Edward's pulse quickened as he pulled her back gently, his eyes locking onto hers. "I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want any part of this, whatever it is they're playing." Agatha's eyes softened for the briefest moment, but there was no pity in them. "It's too late for that. We're already in it." She wrenched her arm from his grip, her eyes avoiding his as she walked toward the door. Edward could feel his heart racing in his chest, the panic threatening to overtake him. But he couldn't stop her, no matter how much he wanted to. Agatha had made her decision long before he had. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, sharp and commanding. Edward stood frozen, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had hoped for a moment, a fleeting moment, that it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. Barbara's voice came through the door before he could even open it, soft but deliberate. "Edward, darling, it's time." He opened the door, his hand trembling as it gripped the handle. There they stood, as confident and cold as ever. Alfred with his usual smug smile, Barbara with her composed elegance, but this time there was no warmth in their expressions, just calculation. Alfred stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over Edward with a predatory gaze. "How are you feeling this morning, Edward?" His tone was casual, as if they had all just been through a typical night of drinking and laughter. But the underlying message was clear. "We're not done yet." Edward didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to. His throat felt dry and his hands were clammy, but he forced the words out. "I don't think I can keep doing this. Whatever this is—" Barbara's sharp laugh cut him off, and she stepped forward, brushing past him with an almost delicate touch. "It's not about what you can or can't do, Edward. You already chose." She turned her gaze to Agatha, who had remained standing by the stairs, her face pale and unreadable. "We all did." Agatha didn't respond immediately. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She simply nodded, the faintest flicker of emotion passing through her eyes. Whether it was guilt or regret, Edward couldn't tell. Alfred's voice was soft now, his steps slow as he approached Edward. "You've lost, Edward. We all have. It's too late to go back. And honestly, the fun is just beginning." Edward's stomach churned, the words sinking in deeper than he expected. It wasn't just a game anymore. It never had been. The realization hit him like a cold wave, and for the first time in years he felt utterly powerless. As they all stood there, the weight of the situation hung in the air like a thick fog. Edward wanted to scream, to lash out, to fight for control, but he couldn't find his voice. Agatha stood by his side, but she wasn't his ally anymore. She had already crossed over into their world, into their game, and there was no coming back. Barbara's cold eyes flicked between the two of them, a small smile curling at the corners of her lips. "You think you can walk away from this?" she asked, her voice a low, mocking whisper. "You think you can undo what's been done?" Agatha's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she remained silent. The words caught in her throat, the truth of the night before strangling her. She had done it. She had crossed that line, and now there was no going back. Edward knew, with a sickening certainty, that the dark truth had already been revealed, and it was too late for anyone to escape its grasp. The morning after the confrontation, a cold silence settled over the house. Edward had not slept. Neither had Agatha. They remained in separate corners of their world, too afraid to speak, too afraid to face each other. The events of the past few days had spiraled beyond their control, and now they were on the edge of something they could not understand or undo. It was late in the afternoon when the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside the house jolted Edward from his thoughts. He had been sitting in the study pretending to work, but his mind was elsewhere, on the conversation they had yet to have, on the threat that lingered between them, and on the unshakable feeling that everything was falling apart. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. Edward stood slowly, his heart racing as the dread crept up his spine. Not now, he thought, but he knew it was inevitable. He could hear footsteps on the front porch, and then a voice. Edward Dawson? He opened the door, and standing on the threshold was Detective Olivia Gray, her sharp eyes scanning the house with a practiced ease. She was tall, with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense expression. Beside her stood her partner, Detective Mark Rivers, a man of medium height with a calm demeanor, but eyes that seemed to be always assessing. "Yes?" Edward asked, trying to steady his breath, his voice sounding thinner than he intended. "Detective Gray, this is Detective Rivers," she introduced herself. "We're investigating an incident that took place here last night." Edward's stomach dropped. The weight of the words hit him like a blow. They knew. "I didn't think anything unusual happened," Edward said, trying to remain composed, though the unease in his voice betrayed him. "There was just a dinner party. Mind if we come in?" Detective Gray cut him off, her voice firm but not unfriendly. Edward stepped aside, letting them into the entryway. The detectives didn't waste any time. They moved through the house with practiced efficiency, taking in their surroundings, their eyes narrowing at the fine furnishings, the expensive decor. They were clearly aware of the wealth the Dawson family possessed, but it didn't seem to matter. To them, this was about something far more complicated. "Where's your wife, Mr. Dawson?" Detective Gray asked. Edward's eyes flicked nervously to the stairs. "She's upstairs. I'll fetch her." Detective Rivers spoke before Edward could move. "We'd prefer to speak with her together, if you don't mind." Edward nodded stiffly, though the tension in his shoulders was palpable. He couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. Minutes later, Agatha joined them in the living room, her face pale, her eyes tired. She had no makeup on, her hair loosely pulled back in a ponytail. She looked like a woman who had not slept in days, and that was the truth. She hadn't. The same shadows that haunted Edward's mind were now mirrored in her eyes. "Mrs. Dawson," Detective Gray began, her voice calm but assertive, "we need to talk about the events of last night." Agatha's gaze flicked toward Edward, who stood beside her, watching her intently. There was no going back now. She knew that whatever she said next would only make things worse. "Go ahead," Agatha said, her voice steady, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed her nerves. "We've received reports of some unusual activities," Detective Rivers continued. "It appears there was a disturbance at your home last night. We have reason to believe that a crime was committed." Edward's throat tightened. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or terrified. They had no idea what had happened the previous night, the secrets they'd shared, the boundaries they'd crossed, and the promises they had made to each other in the dark. No one knew, not even Agatha. But now they had to explain it, even if the truth seemed too unspeakable to say aloud. "I don't understand," Agatha said softly, her gaze flicking from one detective to the other. "What are you accusing us of?" Detective Gray stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Agatha's face. "We have reason to believe that there was an exchange of partners at your residence last night. That's what we've been told anyway." Edward's breath caught in his throat, his mind spiraling. Who told them? How did they know? The whispers of last night's events seemed to hover in the air like a dark storm cloud. They were all going to be caught in it. All of them. "We were just," Edward started, but Detective Gray held up a hand, silencing him. "We need to know what happened, Mrs. Dawson," she said. "Did anything escalate? Were there any altercations? Did anyone leave the premises after the dinner?" Agatha glanced briefly at Edward, her face unreadable. She could feel the weight of the detective's eyes on her, and in that moment, she knew that nothing could undo the events of the night before. But how much should she tell them? Would telling the whole truth only make things worse? "We had a party," Agatha said finally, her voice low. "A dinner. Nothing unusual. We invited Alfred and Barbara over. There were drinks, a little conversation, and then we agreed to do something unconventional." Edward flinched at the words. He had never imagined he'd hear Agatha say such things out loud. The coldness in her voice made him question everything, their marriage, their decisions, the boundaries they had crossed. "And that's it?" Detective Rivers pressed. "Nothing else happened?" Agatha's silence was deafening, and for a moment, neither she nor Edward spoke. The detective's gaze was unwavering, waiting for a response. Finally, Edward spoke. "What are you implying?" His voice was tight, and he could feel the pulse of fear in his throat. Detective Gray leaned in, her voice soft but with an edge. "There's been talk, Mr. Dawson, of something darker going on. We've heard about infidelity, manipulation, and coercion. If you know anything about that, it's time to come clean." The room seemed to freeze, the words hanging in the air like poison. Agatha's lips parted, and for a moment it looked like she might say something. Something that could change everything. But she didn't. She looked down at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap. Edward's mind raced, but he didn't know what to say. The truth was too dangerous to reveal. And yet, the more he tried to keep it hidden, the more it seemed to unravel before him. As the detectives continued their questioning, both Agatha and Edward knew that the night they had shared with Alfred and Barbara was a dangerous thing, a thing that couldn't be fully explained or understood. There were too many lies, too many secrets buried beneath the surface. But what haunted them the most was the question they couldn't answer. What had they truly become? The investigation was far from over, but it was clear to both of them that the dark truth was beginning to surface, a truth they could no longer hide from. The days that followed the investigation seemed to blur together in a haze of dread and uncertainty. Edward and Agatha found themselves trapped in the limbo of their own making, a place where every word, every glance, carried the heavy burden of the truth they could no longer avoid. The events of that night, once buried deep within the confines of their home, had now spilled into the light, and there was no escaping them. Edward sat in his study, his hands trembling as he stared at the papers in front of him. But he wasn't reading. His mind was elsewhere, in a place where the guilt and shame weighed so heavily on him that he could barely breathe. He hadn't been able to sleep for days, not since Detective Gray's visit. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of Alfred and Barbara, their smug, triumphant expressions lingering in his mind like ghosts. Agatha's absence from the room was suffocating. She hadn't said a word to him since the night of the interrogation, retreating into herself with an eerie silence that only made the tension between them more palpable. Every time he attempted to approach her, to speak to her, she pulled further away. The house, once a symbol of comfort and security, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on him from every side, and he couldn't escape. He couldn't escape Agatha. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of crimson and gold, Edward found himself standing in front of their bedroom door. He could hear the soft rustling of Agatha moving inside, the sound of her preparing for bed, perhaps. She hadn't left the room all day, and it felt like the distance between them had grown with every passing hour. Taking a deep breath, Edward opened the door. The room was dim, with only a small lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. Agatha sat on the edge of the bed, her back turned to him. Her posture was stiff, as if she was trying to hold herself together, but her shoulders were tense, and her fingers were curled tightly around the edge of the blanket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Edward felt a knot in his stomach. He had tried to imagine this moment 1,000 times in his mind, but nothing could have prepared him for the coldness he felt now. "I need to know, Agatha," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we done?" Agatha's shoulders stiffened at his words, and for a moment Edward thought she might ignore him, as she had been doing for days. But she didn't. Slowly she turned to face him, her eyes hollow, empty. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Do you want us to be done?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Edward felt his heart race as he tried to process the weight of it. Did he want them to be done? Part of him did, but another part of him wasn't sure. There was so much that had been left unsaid, so many truths buried beneath the surface. "I don't know," he repeated, his voice cracking. He stepped closer, but Agatha pulled away, her face hardening with a look of resignation. "You've already made your choice, Edward," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. All of this, it's who we are now. It's who I am now." There's no going back. Edward's breath caught in his throat. Is that what this had come to? He had hoped for something different, something more, but there was no escaping the reality of what they had become. I never wanted this, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I never wanted to lose you. You didn't lose me, Agatha replied, her voice softer now, but there was no warmth in it. You just stopped seeing me. The next few days passed in a haze of silence. The house was filled with empty spaces, physical and emotional. Edward tried to focus on his work, but the reports from the police investigation continued to loom over him. The whispers of neighbors and colleagues, the lingering questions from the detectives. It all felt like a slow burn that was consuming him from the inside out. At night, Agatha remained distant. They didn't speak unless they had to, and even then, their words felt hollow. There was no longer any comfort in their shared silence. Every moment was an endless reminder of what they had lost. One evening, as Edward sat in the living room staring blankly at the TV, there was a knock at the door. His pulse quickened as he rose from the couch, but when he opened it, he was greeted by the last person he expected, Alfred. "What do you want?" Edward asked, his voice sharp, betraying the bitterness he felt. Alfred's eyes flicked to Edward's face, then past him, taking in the state of the house. "I think we need to talk," he said, stepping forward as if he had every right to be there. Edward resisted the urge to slam the door in his face, but barely. "About what?" Alfred grinned, his smile almost smug. "About the consequences, Edward. The consequences of everything that happened." Edward's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of Alfred's words settling into the pit of his stomach, a sickness that he couldn't shake. He wanted to close the door and forget everything, but Alfred had already crossed the threshold, and now he was here, like a specter that wouldn't leave. "I don't want to hear it," Edward said, his voice strained. "You don't get to come in here and lecture me. You have no idea what's happened." "Don't I?" Alfred said softly, stepping further into the house. "You think I'm blind, Edward? I know what happened between you and Barbara. I know what happened between Agatha and me. And now we all have to live with it." Edward's heart raced, and for a moment he felt a flash of anger, but there was no point. The damage had already been done. "I know you think you have some kind of control over this, but you're wrong," Edward said, his voice shaking with frustration. "We're all just puppets in your little game, and I'm done playing." Alfred's smile faltered, but only slightly. "That's your choice, Edward, but you're not the only one who has to live with it. We all do." The confrontation with Alfred was the tipping point for Edward. After he left, Edward sat in the silence of the house, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The consequences of his choices, of their choices, were beginning to tear apart the fabric of his life. Agatha had stopped speaking to him altogether, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. The guilt gnawed at him constantly, a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. And the worst part? The worst part was that he didn't know how to fix it. By the end of the week, Edward found himself at a crossroads. The tension between him and Agatha was unbearable, and the presence of Alfred and Barbara loomed over everything they had once known. He couldn't keep going like this. He needed to make a decision, a choice that would either bring him peace or destroy everything. Agatha stood in the doorway of the bedroom one evening, her arms folded across her chest. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Edward's heart sank. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure he was ready. He nodded, stepping forward to face her. "I think we both know where this is headed," Agatha said, her voice steady. "I don't know if we can come back from this, Edward. I don't know if I want to." Edward's throat tightened as he struggled to find the right words. "Agatha, I'm sorry. I don't think apologies matter anymore," Agatha interrupted. It's too late for that. Edward stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. This was the end. There was no going back. The consequences of their actions had finally caught up to them, and neither of them knew how to make things right. They were lost in the aftermath of their own decisions, trapped in a world that was no longer theirs.